it comes to colorful cities, Hurley, Wisconsin might just take the cake. We've got gangsters living here, we've got corruption, we've got breaking prohibition laws. Pretty much a little bit of everything here in Hurley, Wisconsin. Let's go into the Iron County Historical Society right here in Hurley and learn more. Let's go. Okay, we're now inside the Iron County Historical Museum. I'm with Kristen Kolasar. Kristen, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much for visiting us today.
I have really been astounded by this place. It's definitely unique to all the other museums I've been to on this tour. But let's just start with the room we are in right now. Tell me about this room.
All right, so this is the Iron County Courtroom, and it was the courtroom from 1894 until 1976.
So tell me about some of the interesting aspects of this room.
Okay, so Hurley has a very colorful history, so you can imagine there were a lot of really interesting trials and eccentric people. So the very first justice of the peace was a man named James Blackburn, and he was really an eccentric man. There were many, many trials back in those days. That was when Hurley was first settled, so it was like a rough and tumble frontier town. You had a lot of bar fights, people stealing from each other. Well, it didn't matter what the person did, he always handed down the same exact fine, $14.75. So the people of the town weren't really impressed with that. They wanted some more law and order. So they had another election to see who would be the next justice of the peace. And James had several people running against him, but he was the chairman of the election. So when they did the vote by yay or nay, he was soundly defeated. He had all nays. But he decided to say, well, I hear only the name James Blackburn, and therefore he is reelected to another term. So using his creativity, he was able to stay in office as an ineffective counsel for another term.
Corruption is funny, I think, when it's maybe a century removed. Wow, that is quite something. You know, I'm looking in the courtroom, I'm just imagining, looks like we have where the jury would sit over here. I can see the judge behind here. And then we have a couple interesting items behind us. Tell us about that.
Okay, so when I take my 5th grade class on a field trip here, the kids always notice that the flag looks different. So this is actually a 48-star flag, meaning it was in use 1958 or earlier, before Alaska and Hawaii were admitted to the Union.
And then we also see another sign, no smoking while court is in session. Tell me about that.
Yes, people always get a kick out of that, just to see that hung up, and that was actually in our courtroom.
So let's just talk about, we are in a former courthouse of Iron County. When was the building built?
Well, the building was built in 1893 as a town hall. That was before Iron County existed. When Iron County was incorporated, the county purchased this building for use as its courthouse.
Okay, Kristen, anything else you want to say about this courtroom?
Yes, so the most infamous trial in Hurley's history happened in 1925. So in 1924, there was a man named Andrew Sigler, and he owned the Gogebic Hotel. So Andrew was not a really nice man. He was very abusive to his wife and his children, and he constantly was cheating on his wife. So she had had enough, and on May 2nd, 1924, Andrew Sigler was murdered. So the police investigation named his wife Emma as a suspect to be an accessory to his murder. This was really unusual to charge a woman at the time. So the trial happened in early 1925, and the jury deliberated for 27 hours before finally declaring Emma to be guilty. And she was given a life sentence. So she was only the second woman in the history of Wisconsin to be given a life sentence. And the trial was covered all over the state and the region, and they would have headlines such as 110-pound mother of 4 convicted of murder.
Okay, we'll leave it on that note. Next time, let's head to the mining exhibit room. I think that'll be something new for our tour of all these museums.
All right.
Does that work for you?
Yes, it does.
Okay, we'll do that. We'll be right back. Okay, we're continuing our tour of the Iron County Historical Museum, still here with Kristen Kolasar. Kristen, I've been to a lot of logging exhibits. You do have a logging exhibit here, but this will be the first mining exhibit. Tell me about the mining room.
Okay, so Iron County operated iron ore mines from 1885 until 1964. And the main mines in Iron County were the Cary Mine, the Montreal Mine, and the Germania Mine. But there were many other smaller mines that operated during the early years.
Tell me what it was like to work in one of these mines.
Okay, so the early years of mining were extremely dangerous. In the 1890s, 1 out of every 119 miners died on the job in Iron County. During Iron County's 80 years of mining, there were almost 300 fatalities at the mine, and many others died years later because of lung disease and silicosis.
So how long did mining last in the Hurley area?
So the mines closed in the 1960s. Before that, mining was a wonderful job. It paid well. You could support a family on it, and you would often see generations of fathers and sons working for the same mine. Now, the ore on the Gogebic Range is some of the highest grade in the world, but in the 1950s, technology existed that made lesser quality ore just as strong. So a lot of people started to lose their jobs and leave the area in the 1960s. In all, there were 318 million tons of ore that left the Gogebic Range from 1885 to 1967. And that ore was used to make the steel that built skyscrapers, buildings, bridges, and dams all across America.
Okay, Kristen, looking behind us, I see a uniform for miner, I'm guessing. Tell me about that.
All right, so in the very early days, miners wore candles on their helmets. And the candles were lit, and then when they got underground in the shaft, they took the candle off and they stuck it in the wall in order to illuminate the shaft. By the 1930s, the candles were replaced with carbide lamps. So you can see that in the photo of the miners entering the shaft. We also have a photo from the very early 1900s, and it has some women in it, but there were not women miners. Those were actually teachers who were getting a tour of the mine, and the men who were the miners had the candles on their helmets. So miners wore a hard helmet and safety goggles to protect themselves from falling debris. They wore heavy work clothing, heavy work boots, and then they always carried their lunch pail, and a popular choice for lunch was the pasty, and they would eat their lunch right underground as shown in that photo.
Very cool. Okay, tell me, what are some other things you have in the exhibit room?
Okay, so a lot of our mining room is focused on the Montreal Mine. So the Montreal Mine was the deepest iron ore mine in the entire world. It was 4,300 feet deep, and it was owned by the Ogle Bay Norton Company, and they were really good business owners. Since there were so many mines at the time, they wanted to attract the very best workers. So they decided that they were going to build a town around the Montreal Mine, and it would have absolutely everything that their employees would need. So they hired a landscape architect and town planner named Albert Taylor, and he designed little white bungalows for the miners. And the higher your position was, so if you were a supervisor or a chemist or the mine superintendent, your house was still white, but it was larger and it had more amenities.
So that's Hurley,
Montreal.
That's Montreal.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
Montreal.
the town of Montreal.
And that is just west of Hurley.
Yes, and if you drive through Montreal, you'll still see all of those bungalows today.
Okay, very cool. Anything else you want to mention in this room?
Another danger that the miners faced was the cave-in. So iron ore, and there's some iron ore samples right over here, was a very porous rock. And so engineers figured out early on that they were going to need to fortify the shafts to prevent cave-ins. However, even with the timber, sometimes there were still cave-ins, and when that happened, fires may start. So the mines also had to employ firefighters to put out any fires before they got too large and caused fatalities.
Man, that sounds very treacherous. Well, I feel like these miners probably needed some way to forget their problems in the mine, maybe imbibe in some beverages. So I was thinking we go to the bar room next here at the Iron County Historical Studies. Does that sound okay?
Yes, that sounds great.
Okay, let's do that. We'll be right back. All right, what can I fetch you to drink today? Actually, let's skip the drink. Let's stick with the history, Kristen. Tell us about what room we are in. By the way, I should introduce, we are in the Iron County Historical Museum, and what room are we in now?
Well, this is the tavern room, and this was an actual bar that was used at Bert's Tavern on Silver Street.
And tell me about the drinking culture in Hurley.
Okay, so when Hurley was first settled, the mines had opened, and you had thousands of men that rushed to the area to try to make their fortune. You also had the men that were working in the lumberjack camps. So when they got their paychecks, they wanted a place to go, and so taverns sprouted up pretty quickly.
Okay, so the mining, the lumbering, that led to a lot of drinking establishments being formed. And what about, prohibition? That must have stopped things, right, in Hurley?
Well, so Wisconsin liquor license laws at the time stated that you could have one tavern for every 50 residents. So at its peak, Hurley had 89 taverns, and Hurley was never that big of a town. So in the 1910s, there was that anti-liquor talk going on about prohibition, and people in Hurley pretty much ignored it. They thought, well, that will never come to be. Well, in May of 1918, Michigan passed the Volstead Act, which put prohibition into effect and made liquor illegal in Michigan. Now, if you know anything about where Hurley is located, it's right on the Michigan border. So, Wisconsin didn't start prohibition until January of 1920, so you had about a year and a half where everyone from the western UP could just cross the border over to Wisconsin, have as much alcohol as they wanted, and then go back to Michigan. So of course that created some problems for the Michigan State Police, who were trying to enforce the Volstead Act. But what could you do? It was a different state.
I never thought about that. Okay, that makes sense on why Hurley would be even more of a drinking town than you'd think normally in Wisconsin. And there were some colorful figures, right, that passed through Hurley. Tell me about some of those.
Okay, so the Michigan State Police had called Hurley the wettest city in all of America. So the feds were alerted, and they did several raids throughout the 1920s. They didn't really work. There would be headlines like, ran out of padlocks because there were so many taverns in violation. And there was an article in the New York Times that said, Hurley, a town for man's men, because they just ignored prohibition. So because the liquor was flowing so freely, it became a hangout for Al Capone and his gang. And Al's brother Ralph really liked the area, so much so that he purchased the Billy Bar and the Rex Hotel in Mercer. And he lived in Iron County until he died in 1974. So Hurley gained the reputation of being a place where people go to have fun, and it's still known as that to this day. Where 51 ends, the fun begins in Hurley.
That is fun. I've never heard of that phrase. I'm bringing that back to Rhinelander. Thank you so much, Kristen. Where should we head to next?
Let's head to the clock tower.
Okay, let's do that. We'll be right back after the break. We're back on our tour of the Iron County Historical Society here in Hurley, Wisconsin, so with Kristen Kolasar. Kristen, tell me about the construction of this building.
All right, so in 1892, Hurley was a really booming place, and they wanted a really magnificent town hall because they felt that maybe it would draw even more people to the community. So they put out bids, and they hired a young architect by the name of Mr. Ruggles, and he designed this building in the Richardsonian Romanesque style. It was estimated to cost $20,000, and a big expenditure of that $20,000 was this clock tower. And there was some argument around town about, is this really needed for a town hall? But they decided to approve it. Construction came in over budget. It came in at about $27,000, which is equal to $815,000 in today's money. And a jeweler came from Chicago in 1893 to install the clock.
Let's talk about the clock for a little bit then.
Okay.
What is this big contraption right here?
So the original clock worked from 1893 until 1922. In June of 1922, there was a torrential rainstorm, and lightning struck the clock tower, and it actually started it on fire. So the original clock was destroyed, and the county board decided to replace it with this Seth Thomas clock in 1922. and it costs $1,300, which is equal to about $21,500 today. And for this reason, electricity was added into this clock tower because it's an electric clock.
It is a magnificent piece of just manufacturing and design. It is incredible. What else about this clock tower do you want to talk about?
So right now, it isn't working. It worked really well from the 20s through the mid-30s, but when it stopped for the first time, it was during the Great Depression, and the county couldn't set aside the funds to fix it. So throughout periods of its history, it would work, then it would need to be fixed again. For about a dozen years, the clock was stopped at 5 to 5. When the Historical Society took over this building as its museum, there were a couple of donors by the name of John and Willis Sullivan who really wanted the clock working again. So they paid to have this, the clock fixed and the tower refurbished in memory of their parents, John and Ida Sullivan. And you can see these are actually the faces that used to be outside, and they're 5'2".
Okay, and it's not working though anymore. What happened between 81 and now?
Well, it just hasn't been working the last few years. We'd like to get it fixed again, but it's finding someone who's able to fix it. As you can imagine, there's not a lot of people who know how to work on this anymore.
A specialty career, I'm sure. Tell me a little bit about this picture we have right here.
Okay, so this picture was taken shortly after the building opened. You can see the clock right in the corner. So one thing that's really different is that the front doors used to open and the fire wagon would come out. So back in that time, a lot of the buildings were made out of wood and there were frequent fires. However, the fire department did not have its own set of horses. So when the fire bell rang out, the townspeople that lived near the courthouse would rush up to the courthouse to try to be the first to arrive, so they would have the honor of their horses pulling the fire wagon.
Wow, that is so cool. Okay, let's call it for now here in the clock tower. Let's head downstairs for the first time on this tour and go into the weaving room next time. Does that sound okay?
Sounds great, Dan.
Okay, we'll be right back. We're back on our tour of the Iron County Historical Museum. I'm no longer with Kristen Colasar. She ditched me. I am now with Betty Barriga. Betty, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine, thank you.
So let's talk about what room we're in right now. This is another unique aspect to the museum here.
Yes, this is the weaving room, and this is where we make rugs, and the rugs are generating the income to keep the lights on and keep the heat on, and we're probably one of the few museums that have a product for sale. We make rugs, we make placemats and runners, and we do custom work if people want something in a specific color or a length, or a lot of people will have fabric or shirts or something from a loved one that they want a memory rug or something like that. So we're very open to doing that kind of thing.
Okay, and people can also come in and learn the process, kind of history in action, especially with some of the machinery you have here. Tell me about the process of making a rug.
Well, first we take the fabric, we'll have pieces of fabric, and then we have them all cut into strips. Then these strips are sewn together, and after they're sewn together, then they go to the weaver, and then the weaver does the process of actually making the rug.
Can we see it in action?
Sure.
Okay, let's do that.
So this is what we call a two-harness loom. There's pedals down on the floor that I step on, and it makes these, what we call harnesses, go up and down. And right now, this will be open. So when this is open, I can pass this shuttle with all the strips of fabric that have been sewn together through here, and then I pound this in. And when I step on the other pedal, you'll notice that these change up and down, and what happens is the strings cross, and that's what actually holds your fabric in then. So it's just a process of going back and forth, and locking that all in, pounding that in, making sure your edges are nice and straight. I'm real picky about that. Pound it in. Cross those threads, and you just keep going and going, and that's how you can make it as long as you want. And you don't always have to weave fabric. You can weave yarn, you can weave things to wear. So it's not just a matter of just always making rugs. That's what we do here, but a loom has a lot of capabilities to do other things too. You take out all your frustrations.
Well, thank you so much, Betty, and thank you to Kristen as well for helping me on this tour. We'll be right back.